Hey everybody, hope you're hanging in there. Today we are talking about realignment theory and party systems, which really is one of the most fascinating subjects in the study of voting behavior and sort of elections in general. One that I've saved really to this point in the semester, partially because I think that these questions that we're asking about party systems and the way that they function, I think are most interesting when we take the results of a recent election in context of these discussions. And so I'm going to begin this discussion with a little bit of history, right, about the party system from 1800 to 1860 or so, and really let's think about the what these sort of changes to the party system are telling us about the conditions, necessary conditions for party fragmentation, for party restructuring, essentially for the balance of power between the two parties, two plus parties, as we'll see, in our system over time, have shifted dramatically. Because that's the thing I want to compare here in this lesson, this discussion, is having seen some things about these various party systems over time. We want to ask the question: what's going on in 2020? Like, where are we in these kinds of cycles? So let's look, across history at some examples that we have from early American politics, and we'll try in the next sort of phase of this discussion to ask ourselves these questions of what exactly is going on today in party realignment theory. So again, if you know something about the party system starting out in American politics, obviously there was no party system in the first stages of American politics. Instead, we essentially had a this sort of federalist kind of era where George Washington prevailed over the entire system, and no one wanted to admit that these sort of seeds of faction were beginning to grow until it was essentially too late. And so as Washington sort of steps away from office, he exhorts Americans to avoid sort of party politics. He says this is a bad thing. He says, look, the Federalists have become too enamored with Great Britain. These anti-federalists, this coalition of whoever they are, right, anti-federalists, the sort of Jeffersonians, which would eventually become more commonly referred to as the Democratic Republicans. These people are big fans of France. Like we're messing with international politics. We've got all these problems. We've in the 1790s, we've had all of these Jay Treaty sort of arguments, and we've had the Citizen Genet affair, and all kinds of stuff has been happening where the two-party system has started to emerge. And so this party system crystallizes by the election of 1792, and especially in 1796. Again, we've got kind of the Federalists versus, this is maybe a little bit of an overstatement, but they were very much enamored, the Democratic Republicans were at this time, by the French Revolution and by the sort of spirit of populism that arose from that revolution, and all kinds of conflicting viewpoints suddenly in the elite discourse of American politics. And so if we go up to 1796, right, this is the kind of the first election where we've got a really hotly contested kind of election here. We've got Thomas Jefferson earning a lot of electoral votes here in the South and in the new sort of the Western territories, Tennessee having been added very recently, and Kentucky to the Union. And then, of course, in the North, which is more of a Federalist stronghold, you've got Adams winning a large number of electoral votes. And then, of course, in some of these states, like in Virginia and Pennsylvania and North Carolina, the electors are split for various reasons, either because there were elections where electors chose the specific single electors were chosen by a congressional district, or because you had certain electors from the state legislature voting against Jefferson. And so this is a really hotly contested election, and it leads ultimately to the crystallization of this new party system. You can see, it's really, the balance is quite strong here. The 21 electoral votes in Virginia versus the 16 in Massachusetts and the 12 in New York. That's really where the bulk of this contestation is happening. And of course, don't forget about Maryland, which, as this kind of middle state, right, a state of middle disposition, it's always been seemingly splitting its votes almost equally for the two candidates. So again, like as this first kind of experience with this system starts to show this idea that the Electoral College is not going to be unanimous, right? And in fact, as we saw in this contest, it's actually quite possible that the Electoral College breaks down, and this would result in a constitutional amendment whereby essentially the slates of electors chosen would end up with rivalrous party factions holding the presidency and the vice presidency. So yeah, that's not good, right? By 1800, this pivotal election of 1800, this is also sometimes labeled the Revolution of 1800. This is when essentially the Democratic-Republican coalition, led by Thomas Jefferson, manages to get over the hump. And they beat John Adams. The Federalists are defeated, essentially, for the first time. And again, we had this pro-decentralization. This is also a big story here, this idea that the Democratic Republicans were becoming more popular in the sort of the Western and Southern territories relative to the more centralized Federalists, which still had their strongholds in New England, essentially. This is a huge story that Thomas Jefferson essentially wins these states, and breaks the party system of the Federalists apart. It essentially obliterates the Federalists sort of for all time after that, where Thomas Jefferson is sort of manages to convince the electors, even of the state of New York, that democratic republicanism is the right way to go. And so this, again, the sort of crushing of the Federalists would only be doubled down upon by the fact that, again, because the Democratic Republicans were a more expansion-focused party and a party that was very interested in protecting and defending outposts in territories where there was still a lot of conflict going on between America and various indigenous tribes, for example. As America expanded westward, they were able to consolidate power even further. And of course, the biggest story here is the Louisiana Purchase, right? So this is seen as being this huge coup for America. The Louisiana Purchase was, if you go back to just a few, decades, or just one decade earlier, right, there was this whole, ongoing argument about whether Spanish and French influence in the interior of America was to continue. And essentially, through a variety of sort of foibles, the foreign powers kind of dropped the ball, and America was able to capitalize in this pivotal moment. So in 1800 and going on, right, it resulted in ultimately sort of this massive popularity of the Democratic Republicans. Maryland's still splitting its votes, of course, because, again, we always do that, at least in the early period, right? Thomas Jefferson defeating Pinckney, who was vice presidential candidate way back in 1796, with Adams, ultimately getting trounced in this election. And I mean, really, it's almost a unanimous electoral college map, which is quite surprising in the grand scheme of things. So essentially, this is an era in American politics where Democratic Republicans start to become the sort of dominant prevailing party, and the Federalists essentially shrivel. They have no more popular support. And I think that's actually a critical phrase to mention here, popular support, because also at the same time that this was happening, again, I don't want to overstate the case, because certainly these are not sort of universal suffrage elections. But one thing that Democratic Republicans were doing with their kind of spirit of the French Revolution mentality is that they were also focused on expanding the suffrage, essentially, and trying to get, still sort of property owning white males, but at least more of them, right, involved in the political process, so that it was not so much of just a pure kind of elite contest. And so as they succeeded in this, and especially, again, as now the newly added territory of Ohio becoming a state, they were able to be more and more successful. And so by 1804, right, Democratic Republican kind of politics was dominant in America once again. And we really had, going back to the Federalist era, for just that fleeting moment, we had kind of a real two-party contestation in the United States. Now we were back to really kind of one-party dominance in American politics. So this is, again, this kind of, sort of an era of good feelings here, where the Democratic Republicans would then turn to James Madison, obviously, a pivotal kind of constitutional framer to hold more power, right? 1808 to 1816. So much so that even during, this is a kind of an incredible story, right? Even during the Madison administration, when literally British ships sailed up the Potomac River and burned Washington to the ground, they still managed to hold power, throughout that period, right? 1814 was when this happened. They were able to essentially, they essentially fomented the War of 1812 against the British as, again, part of that long-term alignment of Democratic Republicans against Britain. War, all kinds of negative outcomes essentially existed. But again, the Federalists at that point were just so non-competitive that like these potentially like murky decisions that were being made even before the War of 1812 and in Madison's first term were just fine, right? They were seen as being just fine. And so this was essentially, right, the the end, right, of a two-party contestation as the Federalists started to break down. But the election of 1812 itself is, I think, a really interesting and important one, and one that, again, speaks to this idea that the party system is nevertheless evolving. And so you can see here, we've got James Madison here, and who's this guy? DeWitt Clinton. Interesting, right? And so this looks like a fairly competitive map. You can see that some of the electoral votes have grown here as we've added new members to the House of Representatives, and we've got, of course, Louisiana in here, right, as a state as well, voting in the election. However, right, if we think about this looks like a really fairly competitive map, more so than in previous years, right, of a Federalist versus an anti-Federalist. It's actually not the case at all. DeWitt Clinton was also a Democratic Republican. He was a dissident Democratic Republican from the state of New York who ran against Madison. Again, this was a sort of unprecedented move where the two parties had sort of no single candidate. So again, this idea of a straight Federalist, right, a Federalist in name and in creed, Rufus King, actually didn't receive the support of his party. So the Federalists themselves actually supported DeWitt Clinton as an alternative, even though DeWitt Clinton was an avowed Democratic Republican. So imagine that in modern terms, right? This idea that they would say, no, we're so weak that we're not even going to run our candidate. We're going to support this dissident Democratic Republican candidate. Because at that point, again, sort of at the national level in American politics, we were functionally, a one-party kind of system. However, right, as Democratic Republicans continue to, again, hold power, right? Again, think about this. 1812, by 1814, Washington is burned. And yet Democratic Republicans are still chugging along through the 1820s through until 1825. Again, Federalists simply weren't able to get their acts together and oppose, form this sort of meaningful, systematic opposition to the Democratic Republicans. They had simply sort of won on all fronts. They had won in terms of changing elections to some extent, in terms of expanding the suffrage. And they'd won it by, again, making their appeal explicitly sort of targeted towards Western states that were continuing to sort of grow and become more populous. And so the institution of the Federalists was broken, or the party institution was fundamentally broken. I mean, in 1820, here you go, John Quincy Adams receiving 0 electoral votes, and so that's a tough pill to swallow. I'm sorry, excuse me, I misspoke, as I often do. John Quincy Adams did receive 1 electoral vote in New Hampshire. So, this is still nevertheless just a definitive repudiation of Federalist politics. This era of good feelings. I mean, this again, like compared to modern American politics, even even some of the very non-competitive electoral college blowouts of the 20th century were not as non-competitive as somebody receiving just a single electoral vote. So, of course, the thing about the Democratic Republicans is that because they sort of dominated these elections, because this kind of single party was so ultimately dominant, they had to essentially serve everyone, right? They were a party that had an incredibly broad base of support. And this is one of the first lessons that we can take when we're reviewing the history of parties and party alignments, is that when a party becomes incredibly large, and when it starts to sort of have multiple wings that it needs to appeal to, we can think about these Western interests. We can think about, even again, as we saw on this map, right? You've got Northern interests, interests in states with more industrialization at this time, states with more trade and commerce considerations, and then big, we've got where did I go here? We've got big agricultural states as well down here, and of course the inclusion now of these new Southern states as well. They had, everybody was on board here. You had states like Indiana and Illinois joining the party here and contributing electoral votes to the Democratic Republicans in Missouri. I mean, this is quite interesting, right? To think that these people with such disparate interests would all be in support of this same Democratic Republican candidate. And so essentially, this is the theory of minimum winning coalitions, which says if you've got a coalition that becomes too large, right? It's like a single celled organism that grows too big. Eventually, it's like, I'm too big. I've got to divide, right? Like I can't sustain this single blobular shape. I've got to break down into like one wing of a party, another wing of a party. And so essentially, the minimum winning coalition essentially says that if you've got too many sort of wings of your party that are too strong, eventually there are going to be cracks that form in those coalitions, and you will eventually betray one of those groups with some sort of policy you create, and you're going to end up with a schism. And so 1824 was that schism, and the schism came in the form of Andrew Jackson, hero of the Battle of New Orleans. Everybody knew him. He was pivotal in defeating the British, in the War of 1812. This was probably the most sort of decisive point of American pride to that time. Again, because the British like totally stomped us in most of the War of 1812. We had a couple of wins on the high seas, a couple of famous naval battles, but mostly we got stomped up and down all parts of Canada. We ended up getting trounced. They burned Washington. The ships came, and we lost New York. We lost Boston. It wasn't a good look for the United States. And here comes Andrew Jackson on his brilliant white steed, and he comes in and he's this war hero essentially. The British capitulate because they realize they've extended themselves too far, and they're willing to let essentially all of the previously occupied holdings that Canada had won, or British Canada had won in the Midwest, go back to the United States. They sort of did this hard reset, and so it was considered like he saved the Union, right? Obviously, he didn't really. He won one battle in New Orleans, which the British super screwed up. But he was seen as this figurehead, this sort of victor in this pivotal battle for American pride. And so Andrew Jackson comes in. By 1828, essentially, he has appealed to this populist wing, especially the Western sort of interests in this party, and he essentially dominates this existing party. The party didn't expect Andrew Jackson. He came out of nowhere. They didn't think that he was going to become a politically viable candidate. And essentially, on the back of the Tariff of Abominations, right? Maybe you remember this from a high school history class or something. He essentially argued economic policy in favor of the South and West relative to the mercantile and industrial North. And again said, I am not a Democratic Republican, I am a Democrat. Okay, so for the first time, we had this label, this new party label, where again he broke with the existing kind of party elite in the Democratic Republican era of good feelings party, and said, no, it's about popular politics and not about republicanism. I'm a man of the people. And so Andrew Jackson, many of you probably know of his many sordid dealings and all of the sort of very problematic decisions that he made in the White House. One rather humorous anecdote of Andrew Jackson's kind of populism was that he actually wheeled in an enormous 6-foot tall wheel of cheese into the White House, and he would invite just the public to come to the White House and carve off a hunk of cheese to take back with them as a sort of symbol of goodwill to the public, because he saw himself as this kind of president of the people. Again, a very specific style of populism at a time when Federalists and kind of the kind of Federalist spirit that would again be sort of co-opted by a wing of the Democratic Republican Party, viewed this Republican principle and the idea that elites still needed to exert a lot of influence over the system as being important. And here comes Andrew Jackson inviting whoever the heck to come in and grab themselves a hunk of cheese. And in fact, that cheese smell remained in that room in the White House for many decades later, and people still claim that they can smell the cheese from Andrew Jackson. And so again, this is a new political movement, essentially a political movement that breaks down the era of good feelings, breaks down this party system and Jacksonian democracy. Ultimately, in 1828, again, we have John Quincy Adams. Actually, kind of interestingly, we have now a Federalist response, right, to the Democratic Republican, or at least in this case now the Jacksonian Democratic response. Maryland, again, splitting their votes quite neutrally, but in fact going in this case for John Quincy Adams. And again, in New England and other mercantile states, in repudiation of this kind of pro-West, pro-South policy. So now, once again, we've got a kind of a competitive two-party system. If we add these up, right, Jackson wins by a lot. I mean, Pennsylvania here is one of the biggest states, in fact, the biggest state in terms of New York is still larger. But winning Pennsylvania and winning the majority of New York's electors is a big deal. So he ends up coming away with the victory. So the Jacksonian democracy ushers in essentially a new set of competitive parties. And so the Jacksonian Democrats, which would come to be called the Democrats, would compete against this Whig party, which again the former Federalists, we saw John Quincy Adams running in this election as somebody who kind of was carrying the torch of his father's party. Of course, John Adams and his original Federalist contingent. And again, this idea of the National Republicans, which is these are the Democratic Republicans that had been kicked out of the Democratic Republican establishment when Jackson came in and rode his stallion into the middle of this party and fractured it irreparably. And so William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, which interestingly, right, these are some people who went to bat and fought in Indiana Territory, and they were sort of war heroes as well. People who were quite involved in kind of this policy of westward expansion were nevertheless essentially these national Republicans who favored policies which would be more amenable to the Northeast, especially and manufacturing. So as this party system sort of reestablished itself, you had these new characters come on the scene and try to repudiate the direct kind of arguments of this particular candidate. So again, there's also a personalism to the Democratic establishment at that time, where Jackson had them all in thrall. And again, if we think to the modern, obviously I'm trying to make parallels to the modern system, a lot of observers early in 2016 said, oh, Trump is like a Jackson, right? And I think there's some reasons why those two are not as directly comparable as some of these pundits might like. But certainly there is some level to this idea of sort of personalist populism is maybe one of the reasons why Trump maintains a strong appeal among a subset of voters. Democrats, of course, also competed against these other third parties, the Free Soil Party, right? And this weird thing called the Republican Party, which, they were these kind of single issue parties that were focused on abolitionism. And so John C. Fremont, for example, being a notable name there. Of course, we had Millard Fillmore's Know Nothing or American Party, which was sort of a hard right anti-immigrant party at the time. And again, if you want to learn more about that stuff, I encourage you to go back to your history texts. But again, this idea was as the Jacksonian Democratic coalition started to break down, or as Jackson kind of ushered in a new fragmentation to the party system, there were the murmurings of all kinds of different ideological positions that were starting to sort of bubble up to the national political level. So obviously, right, new issues were coming on the agenda beyond just like France versus Britain, or like, mercantilism versus, agricultural policy, or westward expansion versus like doubling down on infrastructure, in the Northeast. New things were afoot, certainly. And of course, since we all know our history, right, this particular Free Soil and Republican sort of sentiment was going to become quite important very soon. And so, of course, this brings us to the pivotal moment, the one that you've been waiting for, the election of 1860, in which the Democrats, again, this sort of Jacksonian-inspired Democratic sort of incumbent party organization, fractured. They fragmented into these factions, specifically over the issue of slavery. The issue was a cross-cutting issue. It was an issue that was essentially that the current political party system could not accommodate easily. Because within that Democratic coalition, you had some people who were pro-slavery and some people who were anti-slavery. And again, if you go back to that map, right, we saw that the Democratic Republicans, that cut straight across the Mason-Dixon line. And so you had essentially Northerners and Southerners who were previously allies in politics, suddenly realizing, if we're going to talk about the slavery issue finally, right, which, some people were talking about far earlier, I just want to point that out. If this is going to actually become the basis of contestation in the national level party system, then we got a problem. And so there was this breakdown. And so we had Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats who were essentially competing suddenly against one another. Then we had the Constitutional Union Party, which was essentially trying to hold the Union together without addressing the slavery issue. And then, of course, the Republicans, led by, again, a new great figure, Abraham Lincoln. This is a very famous electoral map and one that deserves a lot of study. Essentially, we have in the North, right, we've got the Lincoln Republicans, and of course in California and Oregon, these kind of new states who have been recently admitted. In the South, we've got obviously many voters choosing Breckinridge, and then we've got a couple of states here for Bell, and then of course Douglas getting Missouri, and just a couple of states in New Jersey, right? But at the end of the day, right, this is actually, if we add up all of these numbers, right, this is a narrow win for Lincoln, and essentially the inauguration of a party that's platform had explicitly stated that they were anti-slavery. By the way, I also want to mention the sordid history that Maryland at this point was no longer splitting their electoral votes and actually cast all of them for Breckinridge. Good times, claim to fame. Not so good times, actually. And I guess Delaware also in the mix as a state that, again, with its historical middle disposition, managed to somehow vote against Abraham Lincoln. But yeah, so this is, without belaboring the point, one of the, if not the most important election in American history, and really a very interesting sort of test of the Electoral College. Because at the end of the day, right, this four-way split in the party system allows for Lincoln to win. But what I think it shows us more than anything is it's a commentary on party realignments and the rise and fall of parties specifically, and the way that parties actually function in practice to hold power, to maintain power over time. And so I want to think about this from the perspective of some of the readings, and particularly, right, if we think about this particular election of 1860 and some of the others that we've just talked about, right? This, the first Jacksonian sort of breakthrough, 1824. What conditions do we need for this realignment? Right? What makes for a realigning election relative to just an election? And what does it mean to have an election where we anticipate that there's going to be dramatic and sort of unfixable or permanent changes to the system of contestation of the two parties? And what do we need, right? Another question that we can consider in this discussion is, do realignments need to result in a change in the power of political parties? That is to say, is it still possible to have a realigning election in which one party might lose, but is nevertheless still present on the political scene and nevertheless still wields some degree of power, right? Is it necessary that realignments essentially obliterate the electoral fortunes of one party, which casts them into the dustbin of history and causes this, new turnover? Is that what we are talking about when we talk about realignments? Or are realignments something slightly different? And then another thing is, when we talk about realignments, often we talk about how realignments usher in new eras of politics. And so, further complicating these definitional considerations, if the corollary is that realignments make new eras, then what's an era, right? Is 12 years sufficient to call this a realignment era, right? Again, I think about, for example, like Ronald Reagan, like winning, in a gigantic electoral college landslide. Was that a realignment? I think a lot of people at the time were writing and saying, like, an electoral victory of this magnitude will crush the Democratic Party. They'll never survive. And yet, nevertheless, in 2020, we've got like a highly competitive, contestation between Republicans and, those Democrats that never really went anywhere. What do we need? What are the necessary preconditions for us to call an election a realignment? Another question is, right, going back to this theory of, this idea of the minimum winning coalition, right? Is this really do these realignments, these sort of, reallocations of the party system, the emergence of new parties and the diminishing and, in many cases, destruction of an old party, do these happen when one party becomes too powerful, when one party starts to gain and gain and gain in the sort of share of the electorate that they've captured? Kind of talking about that single cell organism getting too large and having to break. Is this what we're talking about? Or is it, possible that parties can rise and fall regardless of the essentially size of a minimum winning coalition? So if we go back to the Niemi et al. Kind of argument, what they would say is that realignments ultimately are about kind of two things, right? Demographic changes, or some change to the foundation of what's on offer, like what we're competing over. And then this kind of critical, what we call realigning event, or some sort of historical, world historical moment that changes the game, right? That causes the parties to have to react in a new way, and that makes voters start to reconsider their commitments to these parties. Because remember, again, if we're thinking about this macro level stuff, we always need to keep in mind the fact that we've studied for the span of this whole semester cognitive attachments to political parties and their relative strength. The center of the funnel of causality is I like these guys, they're my home team, and I don't like those guys, they're the bad guys, right? And so if we've got that in the minds of individual voters, realignments are going to have to, almost necessarily require some kind of different things to happen, right? People need to change, the actual composition of the population might need to change in that case. And something might need to happen, this flashpoint, which changes, causes people to be like, well, I once said this, but now I'm rethinking everything. And so that I think is a really important point, and really kind of those two preconditions might tell us a lot. And going back again to the examples we just spoke about, think about some of these elections. 1860 is a great example. Niemi and et al. Are going to be able to explain 1860 really well using a theory that relies on those two things. Right? Demographic change is happening, and then of course the pivotal issue essentially of slavery becoming impossible to ignore at that time with westward expansion and the question of which states would be free and which states would not, and real change in the political culture coming in with the expansion of northern population. That's easily explained, I think, by a Niemi et al. Kind of argument. But we can talk about 1860 as a critical realigning election, but that leaves us with basically one realignment that fits into our basket of realignments. Carmines and Stimson. This is a book that is really famous in political science. I actually had the great fortune of being able to work with both of these people. So Jim Stimson actually was somebody I was able to take some of his courses as an undergraduate, actually at UNC. He had just come to UNC, and it was really fun to get to take advantage of his expertise. And then Ted Carmines actually was somebody who I worked quite closely with in Indiana in my graduate program. And so I managed to sort of double up on the Carmines and Stimson connection in my training. But I think that there's a reason why this book is one of the single most cited books in the history of political science. You can go on Google Scholar and see it's been cited not hundreds, but tens of thousands of times. It's an extraordinarily pivotal, important work, this idea of issue evolution. And so Carmines and Stimson's theory focuses on opinion change and goes back into the psychological literature on voting behavior and public opinion in order to make a micro-level argument about macro-level party change. And so they talk about political contestation from the perspective of a life cycle. And their kind of imagery and their metaphor in describing this theory is very much based in biology. Right? They think about the life and death of parties and evolution, essentially evolutionary theory, to explain how parties compete. Because again, if we think about Darwinian evolutionary theory, what are we talking about? At the end of the day, it's all about essentially organisms trying to find niches that will allow them to survive and adapting over time, successively, through successive generations, to fill niches more effectively through natural selection. And so this, essentially, what we're talking about is parties developing appeals that fit into the structure of the opinion space in any given political moment. However, Carmines and Stimson write, this is maybe contrary to your Darwinian kind of natural selection logic. They write that by their very nature, all party alignments contain the seeds of their own destruction, which I think is a super important quote and one that really brings into focus any discussion that we might have today about whether 2020 are we on the verge of some kind of realignment. 2016, a lot of people saw the rise of Trumpism and the rise of the sort of personality politics of Trump, and they said, whoa, realignment alarm bells, right? We've got this kind of Jacksonian era all of a sudden. We've got this single, prominent figure coming and shaking up the Republican establishment. And yet maybe that's not the case, or maybe this is something that's a little bit different. This is not a realignment after all. And so I guess the question is, why would it be that party alignments contain the seeds of their own destruction? Well, I would love to discuss this with you in person, but of course the answer to this is found in the reading, essentially. And so essentially the Carmines and Stimson piece makes the case that there's kind of three ways that the parties can react to new issues, okay? So one is they can take a new issue and they can absorb it into their existing party platform. You could think about, for example, let's imagine that there's some kind of world historical conflict in a country that we've never thought about very much, in which there's very little immigration to the United States. Let's say that there's some sort of problem in Mongolia. And so thousands upon thousands of Mongolians decide that they want to seek asylum in the United States. And they all start coming to the United States. the two political parties in America, we could probably assume, are going to have like reactions to this new issue event that are going to probably fall in line with their existing immigration policies. We could imagine Republicans would probably be more reticent to welcome the mass migration of Mongolians. The Democrats would probably have a slightly more welcoming attitude, just on the basis, again, of the way that they've reacted to other kinds of immigration issues in the past. That's an issue where there would be an organic extension, where Republicans, Democrats would be able to stake out straightforward reactions to these issues and say, yeah, okay, we'll do this, you'll do that, and then we'll fight over it, right? Just the way that we fought over all the other immigration issues over the past 20, 30 years. Another thing that we could think about is unsuccessful adaptations, essentially, in which maybe parties sort of try and fail to compete on specific issues and end up just kind of dropping them because they're not able to successfully sort of address them in a way that resonates with voters. The third issue reaction is what's called an issue evolution. An issue evolution is essentially what happens, again, thinking about the issue of slavery, thinking about other major sort of issue, new issues that have come on the agenda in American politics over time. These issues are ones that appear on the agenda. They cut directly across the two parties' coalitions. They capture a ton of attention. That's really important because there's potential issue evolutions, right? There's new cross-cutting issues that might appear a lot, but they might not be salient enough to actually drive wedges in party coalitions. But if you get an issue that satisfies these conditions, where they're cross-cutting, within each party, you've got some Republicans that say yes, some Republicans that say no. Within the Democrats, you've got some Democrats that say yes and some Democrats that say no to some policy proposal. All of a sudden, we've got the seeds of change. And so what Carmichael and Simpson might argue is, again, thinking back to our notion of like political sophistication, for example, that some issues are much more likely to be these critical issue evolution issues than others. And so they would argue that easy issues are the ones that are going to be the most pivotal because these are what we might call gut issues. They don't require a lot of sophistication to be able to understand. So like if we were to say like, oh, net neutrality is going to be the new cross-cutting issue agenda, issue evolution issue, if we were to ask the average American, what is net neutrality? They would be like, what? I've never heard of that. This is confusing. Something about the internet. I don't know. Right. But if we were to say like, oh, hey, like what about, for example, during the civil rights movement, what about like Andrew Johnson's Great Society policies, right? What about like, new, prohibitions on sort of separate but equal accommodations, right? What about that? People will be able to very quickly and easily understand the ramifications of these kinds of policies. They don't need technical expertise to get it. And that's going to mean that their reactions are going to be more gut level, they're going to be stronger, and they're going to be more salient. People will pay more attention to them. So at the end of the day, Carmichael and Simpson sort of argue that what we have here then is a political life cycle where we've got moments where things are very stable, where the kinds of issues, basically the two parties are kind of approaching new issues that come onto the agenda, new like current events, new developments. They're addressing them in ways that make total sense to their partisans, and they're drawing distinctions that are consistent with their previous approaches. And all the Republicans are like, okay, we're on board with that. All the Democrats are like, we're on board with that. And then all of a sudden you get these shocks that come in, and that's when parties realign. And so I guess one question is, if this is a punctuated equilibrium model where we think that things stay the same for a very long time, and then all of a sudden there's this critical moment where there's a tremendous amount of earth-shattering change to the party system, does that work for us, right? Or, if we compare 2016, start with 08 or so, right? The last 4 elections or so, will we say that are we in a moment of equilibrium? Are we in some kind of critical juncture where things are rattling around and starting to move and shift and a landslide's about to occur? Or neither? And if neither, right, does that mean that our punctuated equilibrium model is maybe a poor fit for what's going on today? And again, the question that I kind of want to leave you with right now is, in 2020, right after this election, as again we continue to like count and recount votes and like think about presidential transition, which is being thwarted, where are we in this model? Right? If we think about the two parties and their appeals to voters, what stage of this are we in? Right? Are the two parties further entrenched than they ever were, or are there rumblings? And if there are rumblings, what's our seismological predictions? And that, I think, is a really important kind of thing, right? Does this model that we have now, does this predict these kinds of critical realignments, one of which we might even be experiencing at this moment? So again, I encourage you to think about this. It's a big question. It's a big, broad level question. But I think Harmines and Stimson really point us to the fact that we cannot forget about the micro foundations and about the individual level voter psychology required to be able to make assumptions about changes to the party system. So I hope that you enjoyed this kind of run through some of our early party system. I hope that you have, this has given you something to really think about as you go through this next week. I very much encourage you to raise some questions about this and when we come back together next time. However, for the time being, I hope that you stay safe. I hope that you have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Hope that you have a wonderful time with family and friends, be it through a socially distanced application like a Zoom or a WebEx or in person. Please have a wonderful time, and I look forward to talking to you next time. See you later.